So you guys already just met these four gentlemen here, so I don't think there's a need to reintroduce them. But I guess for our first topic, let's dive into query language. There's kind of a few different views on this, sort of whether a functional query language makes sense, whether a SQL query language makes sense, whether it's an advantage to kind of go after the tremendous understanding and pool of developers that know SQL pretty well. So I guess let's start off with you, Paul, at Influx. Because I think you've kind of had maybe you have an interesting view on this topic, because if I remember correctly, when Influx first launched, you guys were all about having an easy-to-use SQL query language. But now when I follow what's going on the project, it seems like you're maybe walking away from that and getting excited about a non-SQL based query language. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so basically that's born out of just what I've learned over the last 5 years of doing this. And originally when I started Influx as a project, it was based off the work that we had done for Airplane, which was our SaaS server monitoring product. And the thing that happened was I was trying to describe the API to a customer of ours, and he said, "Oh, well, this API endpoint is basically just like a group by in SQL." And I was like, "Oh, let's just add SQL as the thing." And I think early on, that's the thing that made it really take off as a project. It was a simple install, which Graphite didn't have. This was before Docker, and Graphite was a total pain to to get going.
I haven't worked on the Graphite install.
But the thing that I've seen over the last number of years is actually in 2014, when we made the switch from 0.8 to 0.9, and that's when we added tag support. At the same time, that fall, I was giving talks, and I was actually asking people, what's your preferred way for working with time series data? And I could, if I asked the room, half the people would be like, no, SQL is the best way to do it, and half the people would be like, no, functional makes more sense. And I actually thought that functional was a more elegant way to work with time series data, because when I think about working with time series data, it's more like working with matrices than it is working with sets. So I was just too chicken in 2014 to make that change. And now we have no choice but to support that for the rest of the project. But at this point, I feel the beginner use cases, the SQL language makes it really, really easy. But for the more advanced things, it's really, really impossible. You're doing gymnastics to try and make SQL work.
So an evolution of your offering, but maybe a return to your original gut feel about what would be best?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, in fall of 2014, I did feel like functional was the right way to do it. And I think this is actually proven out by Grafana as a user interface, because I think Graphite is a functional language, right? Yeah. And I think the user interface, the query builder in Grafana for Graphite is the first class, best experience that you can see. And I think having that functional language actually lends itself well to building a user interface around it. Yeah.
Sure. So Eric, let's move on to you, since you probably have an opinion on this too. So I've been following Timescale with great interest. By the way, welcome to GrafanaCon. I think this is the first time you've been on this panel, right? Also, congratulations on all the recent funding with Timescale. But what's your view on this topic with SQL versus functional?
Well, I think there's probably a place for the functional approach that Paul is taking with Influx, and I think there's a place for different query languages. They have pros and cons. I think for some scenarios, it's sometimes when you're building something new, you have this feeling that you want to reinvent everything, right? So you shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. So in many cases, I think SQL is a perfectly well-engineered language that's been around for a long time, and there's a benefit to having people know the language, and it's really powerful. But I totally see the point that there's no denying that it's a lot more complex for some people and for some tasks. Looking at Grafana, for example, there's a new data source for Postgres, and if you're writing queries in that data source for Postgres, it's going to be more complicated. I mean, that might improve over time when there's a query editor, etc. But compared to maybe the new IFQL or the Prometheus language, yes, it's probably going to be a bit more complicated, but you can also do much more powerful things. I think like it's up to you as a user to decide what makes sense for you.
Yeah, so I definitely see that there are advantages for sure in having like full SQL support, which unfortunately we don't. Like, right, we have a SQL knockoff, right?
Support.
Yeah, so like basically like you can hook Tableau up to timescale, right? And that's great. But at the same time, like I personally don't want to believe that the best query language was invented 30 years ago and we have to do the exact same thing, right? Yeah.
You're also got to be really conscious of who your users are and what the use cases you're building.
So the other argument I make is like nobody actually wants to write a query. No. SQL or otherwise, like what they want is they just want to get at their data, right? And except for you, because you love to write like PromptQL queries.
It's what I do all day, yeah. No, I think you've got to be conscious of what your users are doing, because in PromptQL we've tried to build a very concise language. We see users, you know, not actually using it mainly to build dashboards, although obviously they do. Like, it's more the exploration use case and actually interactive, like REPL-style interaction with the database. And I think, you know, doing that with SQL is really, really painful. And doing that with, I mean, this, you and I had this debate last week about IfQL, right? Am I allowed to call it IfQL?
No.
No.
I think we are going to change the name.
But, like, you know, it needs to, like, for instance, like, if a query by default spans multiple lines, that really upsets me. Like, you should be able to do really concise queries on a single line that are easy to understand.
So, yeah, I mean, from a design perspective, we actually said, like, we're not optimizing for terseness. We're optimizing for readability and understandability, and the reasoning being, like, you read way more code than you ever write, right? And as anybody who's, like, you know, gone into a project and seen some piece of code and done, like, okay, git blame, who wrote this crap? And you're like, oh, it's me. I wrote it 6 months ago.
Yeah, but like, are your queries that you're sending to your time series database being version controlled, you know? I mean, I guess the one...
In our case, I think they will be.
Okay. I mean,
yeah, like, so our language is actually, it's not like we're going to rename it because it's actually not a query language. It's more like a data processing language, right?
And
like, we'll have, like, imports and scripts that you can pull in and that kind of stuff.
I think that's a different use case. For Prometheus, it is an interactive query language. We do expect, like, the Prometheus default UI has like a single line text box.
For example, I mean, again, I'll talk about this later in the day, but one of our design goals for our new query engine is we wanted to actually decouple the language from the processing system because we want to support PromptQL.
Obviously, everyone does, right?
And speaking of that, that's kind of an interesting next segue. So you just said, Paul, everyone wants to support PromptQL. So obviously, you know, on the Prometheus...
Tom said that.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm hearing things now. Well, okay, so you didn't say that, but it's a fact that you guys are starting to support PromptQL, right, as Influx Data.
Yep.
Meanwhile, you just announced, Dan, that Graphite is doing remote read and remote write support for PromptQL. Obviously, Prometheus is Prometheus, but what about timescale? Are you guys planning on interoperating with the Prometheus project at all?
Partly what my talk is about later today.
I was, okay, awesome.
Yeah, way to bury the lead.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I like PromptQL myself, but it's like, it's easy to do, like if you have a restrictive data model, like Prometheus, which makes total sense for like what Prometheus is doing, then it's going to be easier to make a simple query language that's easy for exploration, etc. But I think like our use case is much broader. Like we're looking at not only metrics, as we're like looking more like IoT and things. And for that kind of data, where you might want to join information together from various data sources, it's too restrictive for those applications.
Sure. Well, let's get into use cases in a second. But just on the PromptQL topic, I'm just trying to establish what's happening here, particularly within the sort of DevOps and IT operations management world, where everyone is implementing PromptQL support. So what's happening here in the DevOps land? I mean, maybe this is going to be contentious for Paul, but are you all just trying to become backends for Prometheus now, and you've given up? Or, I mean, you know, why?
I mean, the thing about Prometheus is, by design, there's no commercial company behind it, right? And that's what the Prometheus developers want.
Same with Graphite. Meanwhile, you guys have raised like $60 million, and you guys have raised like almost 20, I think, right? Or something like that.
It's around 16, I think.
16, also. Right? So very well funded and not at all funded. But your point about that was, sorry.
Yeah, my point is, like, there's no commercial company behind Prometheus,
right.
So of course everybody's in a land grab right now.
Right.
And you hear about every like monitoring vendor going after
a bit of consolidation going on.
Yeah.
Right.
So.
Right. But so you think the land grab is really because different vendors are trying to co-opt this project in their own way, and they see that there isn't a commercial vendor behind it? And
I think there's a reason Prometheus is popular, and the Prometheus query language is popular, especially in the monitoring and like observability space, is because it represents a really nice set of trade-offs between conciseness and expressiveness.
The thing is, I hear it both ways, though. I hear people are like, I hate this language, I don't get it, and I think ultimately, like API design, it's a matter of aesthetic, right? Like, yeah. That's really what you're talking about.
I think that a lot of what's going on with Graphite and with Influx as well is giving people that choice to say, okay, I have all this data that I'm collecting with Prometheus. I like Prometheus. PromptQL is great for some things, but you know, Prometheus without any aggregation, long-term storage, those kinds of things. You want to be able to have the best of both worlds. So that's where you say, okay, well, I want to be able to take that data that I'm collecting with Prometheus and querying in a real-time way in Prometheus and bring it into a system like Graphite or Influx or Metric Tank or whatever else, and then be able to query back into that with PromptQL, ideally, but also be able to leverage the power of the Graphite API or GraphQL or any of the other query languages that maybe are more appropriate for the different jobs. And I don't think you can say, you know, there's going to be one query language to rule them all. I think
that's not what any of us want.
And that's what we've been getting at, I think, here on the panel, is that you know, the different languages have different strengths, different weaknesses, and there's you have to pick the best tool for the job. You know, it's one of those, you know, when all you have is a hammer, everything's a nail. And it's not the way that we build things.
Yeah, and I think our goal is to have as broad of support as possible for the different ways that people want to work with the database, right?
Exactly.
Like, and then, because that's what I'm saying, like, when I ask people in the room, like, half the people say, I want SQL, and half the people will be like, no, I want functional. So some percentage are going to be like, I want PromptQL, and some percentage are going to be like, I want Graphite. Unfortunately, because the data model in Graphite is so different, I don't think it's reasonable for us to be able to support Graphite as a query language. But it's getting closer now, right?
With tags.
Yeah. But it's both, right? Yeah. And you have to support both. I guess the only other system I've seen that in actually is in Monarch. Yeah. The Google time series database.
You found someone to tell you about it.
Huh? Yes, somebody told me about it. That's secret.
Yeah, we've just had that recorded now.
And live streamed. Yeah. No, that's cool. So, you know, it's been interesting to get the updates in terms of what's new in the different databases. Obviously, some major work on pretty much every time series database that's popular in our community. You know, impressive to see the performance gains. You know, both on the Prometheus project, on Influx. You know, we're doing some cool stuff on Metric Tank. You know, I've seen some of the initial stuff from Timescale. But I guess Timescale is unique in that you guys aren't building a purpose-built storage backend, right? You're trying to leverage Postgres, and from what I can tell, you guys consider that an advantage from a interoperability standpoint, from a community standpoint, in terms of, you know, a known, good, very stable quantity standpoint. You know, tell us a little bit about that. I mean, you know, you guys chose Postgres to build on top of. You know, what are the trade-offs there? Do you consider it a liability that, you know, maybe performance and compression isn't as good as some of the purpose-built other solutions, or, you know, are you seeing that that's a little less of an issue? And I should stop talking and let you answer this question.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in there. I mean, the reason why we chose to build the stuff on top of Postgres is that we started out as users ourselves looking for a solution. So we our company started out building more of an IT, you know, data analytics cloud, and we had a database in the back end. We were actually playing around with Influx at some point. But for our data needs, we found that we wanted something more powerful. So we started using Postgres ourselves and sort of trying to implement custom functionality to make it scale to the kind of workload that we needed. And eventually we just figured out that, like, this is actually what the customers want as well. They want this database. So we took it and we made it a product. And so we kind of made that journey. So we understand what the what the usage needs are from the customer's point of view, I think at least. And we hear that a lot from customers. Like I have a Postgres installation, and I've been running it for some time. We have increasing time series data that we're putting into it, and it's not working for us anymore. And that's where we come in, and they can continue using something that they're familiar with. They don't have to switch to something else. They have all their queries. They have, everything set up. They just want something that can take them, beyond the kind of scale that they
Sure. So would you say it's a sweet spot for timescale to go after people who are already using Postgres and are doing time series and have a comfort with Postgres rather than?
Yeah, I mean we're not here to reinvent the wheel in some sense. We're like pretty pragmatical about like solving problems. So we see that there's a need for this kind of stuff out there, and there's certainly a need for other types of time series databases more focused on metrics. And we're not the best database probably for like monitoring or metrics in the sense that like looking at compression, for example. We're not very good at compression. You can get good compression from using like ZFS as a file system, but it's not going to be as optimal as a column store where you can do more sort of impressive things in terms of compression.
So I do have a question actually along the lines of something that Raj mentioned, which is like, he asked like, do you see it as a win that it's based on Postgres and people are familiar with that? And I certainly see the advantages with that, but at the same time, like most people, I would say people hosting their own databases is actually in structural decline, right? Like people are on Heroku or on AWS or on Google or whatever. Like they're not actually hosting their own database. So how do you deal with that?
I'm not sure I understood the question.
Like you can't get timescale on RDS, for example.
No, you can't right now, but eventually, hopefully, you will be able to do that because they have a process to kind of whitelist.
AWS is going to pull an elastic on you.
Who knows?
They're not going to pay you for it.
Yeah. The different concerns of the commercial open source vendors versus
I think the whole debate about like cloud vendors doing their thing is a whole different debate about like how to deal with making money in that space. But there's certainly problems there. But I mean, I think the way to approach this is to maybe do an offering of that you provide yourself that's much better. Mm-hmm. So you try to compete on those terms.
Right. Yeah.
Yep. So, mentioned it before, 2 funded companies, 2 projects that are open source. The Prometheus project has obviously gotten a tremendous amount of mind share and velocity, despite being, a funded project, maybe because of being a funded project. Just curious, Brian, how do you think that dynamic has? Yeah, I'm calling you Brian just because Brian's still watching, and and
I didn't wear my Brian mask today.
Right. Yeah, and I can't even get the name of our newest employee correct. No. But Tom, do you think how's that dynamic played out? Do you consider it to be a strength? Is it a liability? Compared to Influx and timescale, there's not millions of dollars in the bank to allow the project to do whatever it needs to do, right? How does that work out?
I think the genesis of Prometheus at SoundCloud, and because it wasn't the core business to them and they kind of let it go, was brilliant. Right? It really did allow for this ecosystem of companies to develop around Prometheus, and Causal and now Grafana and Julius and Robust Perception, all the guys working on this, funded by other companies, means it is really quite special in that respect. Mm-hmm. And then the CNCF adopted us as the second project. We were always a very close fit with Kubernetes because of its shared heritage at Google. And since adding to the CNCF and effectively becoming the de facto monitoring standard, sorry, Paul, for Kubernetes, we've just seen, I think that's fueling most of our really strong growth. And I think that wouldn't have happened necessarily with a commercial backed project because...
I totally agree with that, yeah.
Because the incentive, not necessarily the incentive, the requirement to be commercially successful if you're VC funded is huge, right? You have to demonstrably show you can make money, and the Prometheus project, we never think about that, right? We actively discourage discussion about that kind of thing, and we want to make sure we're limiting, artificially almost, like the scope of the Prometheus project, like preventing feature creep, to give room for other solutions. You know, like Prometheus will never do distributed, replicated HA as a product. Right? We're never going to do that. We're going to leave that to projects like Thanos from Improbable, Cortex from us, RainTank. Right? We're going to, you know, Influx. We're going to leave it to other people to solve that problem because we want to remain simple, operationally, like, you know, nice, you know, simple and not particularly something we should worry about. And it seems to be
a theme here.
Yeah. So I actually I was talking to somebody at GitLab the other day, and it was interesting. Yeah, it was bad.
Yeah.
And it's interesting the way he was describing it is like he was thinking of Prometheus as like something that should just be ephemeral. So you have your monitoring system and individual app teams can have their own Promethei or whatever.
It's Prometheus, I think.
Ah, okay.
There was a whole talk about this.
But at the same time, like what I've heard from the Prometheus community, specifically like when we were at KubeCon in Austin in December, we had tons of people asking us about the remote read-write capability because while they want all these ephemeral Prometheus servers running and they push the monitoring out there, they still want a central place to actually be able to pull in all that data.
This was intentional, right? We knew that Prometheus as an ephemeral source would allow it to be operationally simple, therefore reliable, easy to deploy, all these things. But we knew eventually as it becomes more popular, the value of the data it holds is going to increase, right? And suddenly companies are caring about storing this data for multiple years. They are caring about going back in time and using this data to do capacity planning. You know, we've got one of our customers is using Causal Service to store like a couple of years worth of data, so they can go and look back at like Thanksgiving and what was the peak.
Yeah, the number I hear is 13 months. Like everybody in
by Magic number
e-commerce, yeah, exactly. It's like we need 13 months worth of data so we can check out Black Friday.
Exactly, yeah. And that's, I think, really valid. Like, and Prometheus will not deal with that. We're not interested. I mean, we have in Prometheus 2.0, we've added backups. So you can take a snapshot and back that up really easily. And with the new 2.0 storage engine, there's actually nothing technically stopping you having a really immense retention period. But we're not going to do replication. We're not going to do HA. We're not going to do these kind of things. And especially when you get into a world of, I've got 30 clusters, each with a Prometheus in, and I need to some way aggregate together into a single server so that I can compare across clusters.
Yeah, writing a distributed system is the worst possible thing you could do with your life.
I've done too many of them.
So we're getting a little bit low on time, but I do want to open up the panel to some questions from the audience in terms of anything about the future state of time series or any of your particular databases. I think we've got we've got a really credible panel here. So any questions from the audience?
Yeah, thanks for all the comments on the different databases. Just to go back to your topic on languages, and that's really the one thing all four of you share. It is a language, right? And when I think about like languages and what people are doing with like natural language processing, and the idea that everything is a query, and with time series now you're constricted to things about time, do you think there's some like possibility of kind of abstracting away, like, okay, you use functional, you use whatever, and just do like NLP on top of it so that, you know, if I know how to write a query in like human readable language, just send it that way and it just works. It would take time,
so you
but
could certainly do that, but I do have a bit of a background. I was like an enthusiast in natural language processing and machine learning, and my belief is natural language systems.
Someone said machine learning.
yeah, I did not
Did
say
I win
that.
bingo?
I didn't say it.
Blockchain's next, don't worry. No, but I feel like it's the, you know, when you call those automated call systems, back in the day, it was press 1 for this, press 2 for this, and then they've added these natural language systems. But it's the same thing. You have to know the exact incantation of the thing you have to say to get at the menu.
That's right. And I think like the point would be is that, you know, if you're going to abstract away, like, you know, like say Grafana is doing it with the data sources, eventually you still have to write your query, and like you said, nobody really wants to be writing queries. So
yeah,
so
the way the IFQL engine works is actually any query can be represented as a JSON object. So it's a DAG, it's a directed acyclic graph. And basically, the parser is a separate thing from the actual thing that the query engine gets handed, right? So that's why we're going to we'll support InfluxQL, IFQL, PromptQL, and maybe a natural language one as well.
So it's, yeah, I mean, there's a couple companies, I think like ThoughtSpot are kind of doing that because people know they don't want to do like non-human questions. They want it to be like the Google of questions.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, in my mind, like what people want is they want the Grafana experience, right? They want to be able to point and clicky and see their data, right? Nobody wants to write a query. Except for you, because you're a freak.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the audience?
I mean, I think on that point, just like one last thing, I think the Prometheus remote read API, which sucks, by the way, and I can say that because I wrote it. I wrote lots of it with Julius. Like, I think that's becoming kind of a, a de facto standard because you're all going to expose it, right? For implementing a query engine on top
So what I'd actually like to see instead of the remote read-write API, the problem with that is it's like super high bandwidth.
Yeah.
The better thing would be if you could just hand the compressed file, right?
Yeah, because then you'll have to understand Prometheus query chunk format, and then we don't want to standardize on that because we want to be able to innovate there.
Right.
But I think going to a way where we can push down aggregates. We're doing design on a panel.
Yeah, let's not.
But we've discussed pushing aggregates down, which I think
pushing is interesting there.
Well, what I mean by pushing,
let's get into a push versus pull discussion now. No, I think we had another question or two from. Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, I had a question about the remote storage because from Prometheus side, it's very interesting that we can have a long-term storage. But the issue I've seen is because I tried the storage, long storage in.
Could you hold the mic?
In Influx, the issue is I would like to query the data once it's stored in Influx with Influx, not necessarily with PromptQL. Okay. Is this going to be possible?
Yeah, so
you can do that. Yeah.
Yeah, for us, the way that it writes data in is actually designed for the new query language, not for the way InfluxQL works. So honestly, the best way to query Influx, if you have the Prometheus remote read-write, is to actually query it through Prometheus so that it will go back to Influx and get the data. But later with IFQL, we'll actually add support so that you can query the data in the way it's written into the database. Yeah. Basically, it was future design that we designed for.
So yeah, in Graphite, things map pretty much directly. Yeah. So you can collect your data with Prometheus, feed it into Graphite, and then be able to query it either via PromptQL or via Graphite, mix and match. Again, use whatever makes the most sense, and that's.
Can you only do the tag-based queries though? You can't do the hierarchical style.
Well, yeah, it's tag-based data.
Right,
so.
right.
Well, yeah, I mean we have an adapter for writing stuff to Graphite as well, which changes that and writes it. I mean, it's horrific, but it allows you to kind of do a little bit more.
It does, but it pushes you back into the hierarchical model.
Yeah, it does.
Which.
Yeah. We've got a similar thing for OpenTSDB as well, which allows you to query in OpenTSDB format. So this is very much a use case we want to support, and if there's a particular issue, then we're working on it, right?
Cool. Any other questions?
Was there a hand over there? Or? No? Can the next guy be from the other side of the room? Because watching Trent run is really fun.
How about for continuous update queries and how that might work across all of the different TSDBs?
I was talking to, where is he, Carl, about this at FOSDEM. Mm-hmm. He's gone. But this is something we should support, right? It will massively reduce the bandwidth and the query load on the back end. But really, I think it's for us to work with the Grafana guys, which hopefully should happen now, right? It should be a bit easier to make this happen. Like, we're talking about doing things like aligning the step with multiples of the steps so that we can always just issue a partial query.
So we have an open feature I called it intelligent rollups. At the time when I created the issue,
it's been open for a while now, Paul. Right? I've been following.
No,
that.
so the thing is, doing that kind of continuous query thing, those updates, it's a trivial feature to implement, but it's non-trivial to make it work at scale, to make it not destroy your database. As anybody who's tried to deal with Graphite could tell you.
Is that the same thing as the kind of incremental queries where what I understand by this is your dashboard just queries for the last minute every time it updates. I mean, right now the Grafana, when it hits Prometheus, always queries for the last
the entire thing, yeah.
Right, which puts a huge amount of load on the dash.
I mean, yeah, for us, for 2.0, basically we're going to have a caching layer built in. We don't currently have a caching layer, so we literally recompute the query every single time. 2.0, we're going to add a caching layer because.
But then that becomes really sensitive to the step, right? If you misalign the step, then. So I think this feature we want to build in, and David and Carl want to build in Grafana will really help both of us.
Seems like you need a query planner.
Well, no. We're hiring for that position right now.
Switching that around though, And putting my Grafana contributor hat back on, there's a lot that we're doing on the Grafana side to support like WebSocket connections from the browser back up to the server. And there's definitely a pathway there to being able to turn that around and say, let Grafana tell the time series database that I want to subscribe to this particular query. Please keep me up to date, and have it push stuff back down the other way.
That's going to be so hard to make it actually work at scale.
I'm trying to think of a nice way of saying
that. That sounds like a nightmare to me.
I mean, but I'm sure there are some backends that welcome this. But
yeah, I think there's a lot of capability there, and whether we push it all the way to the time series database, or whether you have Grafana's got 100 users that are all looking at the same dashboard, looking at the same queries, and the Grafana server is going to be able to push that incremental query back up to the database.
Well, and that's what I'm saying. Like, that's why we're going to have a caching layer. And even with the query planner, people still use memcached in front of Postgres.
So I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff to be done there in terms of what we can do to make things smarter, and certainly the current state of things is not great.
I like that. I like ending in that theme. I think despite the fact that we're all working on different projects, one of the things I know we believe a lot at Grafana Labs is there's always room for more opportunity, more interoperability and collaboration. I think I see unanimous nods. So let's end there. Please give a round of applause for our panel.